Late at night, under a flickering streetlight in Crestview, Alabama's grimy industrial sprawl, 34-year-old Amara Ellis grips a gavel in a sweaty, stained judicial robe, her voice steady as she sentences Officers Trent Carver and Miles Dutton. The shackled cops, once smug, now pale, stare in disbelief at their arrestor-turned-judge. Her triumph peaks as the gavel slams, only for a phone to buzz. Their allies torched her home, promising vengeance. This win's a mirage. What nightmare awaits her next? Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice against corruption, hit like and subscribe for more gripping tales like this. Weeks before that sweat-drenched courtroom victory turned to ashes, Amara Ellis maneuvered her beat-up sedan through the potholed streets of Crestview, Alabama, the city's industrial decay pressing in like a vice around her 34-year-old frame. Her mind a whirlwind of legal briefs and witness testimonies from a corruption case she'd been clawing at for months, a case that could topple the crooked elites who'd long suffocated this town with their greed. Her knuckles tight on the wheel as she navigated the flickering glow of streetlights, barely clinging to life, the clock on her dashboard blinking 11:47 on a muggy Thursday night, her eyes heavy from another late shift at the prosecutor's office where she'd carved out a reputation as a sharp-witted assistant DA, a black woman who'd learned to wield the law like a blade against a system that never wanted her to hold it. Her thoughts racing over the depositions she'd prepped, names of dirty councilmen and backroom deals swimming in her head, when suddenly a harsh glare of red and blue erupted in her rearview mirror, slicing through the quiet hum of her engine, her stomach lurching as she eased the car to the curb, knowing this wasn't about a ticket, not here, not now, not with her skin the color it was in a town like this, her breath catching as two figures emerged from the patrol car behind her, Officers Trent Carver and Miles Dutton, their names whispered in Crestview's black neighborhoods like a curse. Two men infamous for hunting drivers who didn't match their pale ideal of who belonged on these roads, their boots crunching gravel as they approached, flashlights stabbing. Through her window, Carver's broad silhouette looming first, his buzzed head and sneer cutting a menacing shape against the night, Dutton trailing with his wiry frame and pinched face, eyes glinting with something colder than contempt, their voices already laced with venom as Carver barked for her license, claiming her taillight was busted, a lie she could have disproved if they'd let her step out to check. But she stayed still, hands at 10 and 2, her training kicking in, knowing any move could be twisted into an excuse, her voice steady as she asked what she'd done, only for Carver to lean closer, his breath sour with coffee and spite, muttering she was trouble waiting to happen. His words a dog whistle she'd heard too many times, Dutton chiming in with a snicker about her fancy lawyer talk, his flashlight lingering on her navy blazer, the one she'd worn to court that morning, as if her professionalism was a threat they needed to stamp out, her pulse quickening as she handed over her ID, expecting a ticket, maybe a warning. But instead, Carver's grin widened, predatory, and he ordered her out. No explanation, no cause, just a command dripping with the weight of a power he knew she couldn't challenge. Not here, not alone, her jaw tightening as she complied, stepping onto the cracked asphalt, the humid air sticking to her skin, her heels clicking softly as she stood 5'6" against their towering bulk, her mind screaming this was wrong, illegal, a violation of every code she'd memorized in law school. But before she could cite procedure, Dutton grabbed her arm, wrenching it behind her, accusing her of resisting when all she'd done was flinch, Carver's meaty hand clamping her other wrist, twisting until she gasped, the cuffs snapping on. With a cold bite, her protests drowned by their shouts. Stop fighting, though she hadn't, her body rigid with shock as they shoved her against the car, her cheek pressed to the warm hood, the metal tasting of rust and defeat, her eyes darting to the side where a handful of onlookers had gathered, phones out, filming, their silhouettes blurred against the streetlights, a teenage boy in a hoodie, an older woman with a grocery bag, their murmurs rising but none stepping forward, fear rooting them as deep as it did her, the video catching Carver's snarl as he yanked her upright, calling her a mouthy black bitch who needed to learn her place, Dutton laughing, adding she'd look good in a cell, their words a public execution of her dignity, her career flashing before her, years of fighting for justice in a system that hated her. now reduced to this, a spectacle for strangers who'd post it online, her heart hammering as they dragged her toward their cruiser. Her sedan left abandoned on the curb, keys still dangling. In the ignition, her mind racing with legal counters she couldn't voice. Not yet. Not with their hands on her, not with the crowd watching, helpless. Her arrest a spark that'd ignite outrage, she knew, but also the first domino in a chain of horrors she couldn't yet see. Her breath shallow as the cruiser's door slammed shut, locking her in with the stench of sweat and vinyl. Carver climbing in front, Dutton riding shotgun, their radios crackling as they peeled off, leaving her car, her freedom, her fight behind, the night swallowing her whole, her resolve hardening even as her wrists ached because this wasn't just a stop. It was a declaration of war, one she'd wage with every ounce of her being, though she didn't know then how. Viciously they'd strike back, how this moment would spiral into a nightmare that'd test her soul, her strength, her very survival. The city's pulse thrumming outside the window as they sped toward the precinct, her eyes narrowing, plotting. Because Amara Ellis didn't break. Not yet, not ever. Even as the cuffs cut deeper, even as the darkness closed in, even as she felt the weight of a town that'd rather see her crushed than rising. The first battle lost, but the war just beginning, her mind already turning to the complaint she'd file, the footage she'd use, the justice she'd claw back, unaware that this stop was only the opening salvo in a barrage of brutality that'd push her to the edge, then over it, into a fight she'd never imagined. One where every step forward would meet a fist twice as hard, every win a trap snapping shut, every breath a gamble with death itself. The road ahead a gauntlet of racism so raw it'd make this night seem tame. Her arrest not just a moment, but a catalyst, a wound that'd fester, a fire that'd burn. Her story that'd unfold in blood and defiance, because in Crestview justice wasn't given, it was taken. And Amara was about to learn how steep the cost would be, how deep the hate ran, how far she'd have to go to stand tall again if she ever could. The cruiser's taillights fading into the night as the city watched, waited, and whispered her name, a name that'd soon echo louder than she'd ever dreamed or feared in a battle that'd leave scars she couldn't yet fathom, scars that'd mark her, define her, drive her, as the war for her life, her truth, her power roared to life under those flickering lights, on that cracked asphalt, in that humid, hateful air. Amara Ellis's wrists burned as officers Trent Carver and Miles Dutton hauled her into the Crestview precinct. A squat, crumbling fortress of peeling paint and buzzing fluorescence, the air thick with mildew and menace, her heels scraping the chipped linoleum as they shoved her past a rusted booking desk where a bored clerk barely glanced up, her navy blazer now wrinkled and streaked with dirt from the car hood they'd pinned her against, her mind a storm of fury and calculation. Every legal statute she'd memorized screaming this was wrong, but her voice drowned by Carver's meaty grip on her arm, his sneer twisting as he barked at her to move, Dutton trailing with a smirk, his wiry fingers flexing like he itched to hit something or someone, her eyes darting to the holding cell. Ahead, a steel cage streaked with grime, its bars a silent promise of humiliation, her breath hitching as they flung her inside, the door clanging shut with a finality that echoed in her bones, Carver looming close, his breath hot and rancid as he hissed she'd learn her place tonight, his words a venomous slurry of slurs, uppity and worse, spat like bullets. Dutton chiming in with a laugh, promising she'd look real pretty behind bars. Their taunts a public stripping of her dignity, her 34 years of fighting for respect in courtrooms and classrooms reduced to this, a black woman caged by men who saw her as less than human. Her gaze catching a third figure in the shadows, Officer Lucas Hayes, younger, leaner, his brown eyes flickering with something, guilt maybe, or doubt, as he lingered near the desk, hands stuffed in his pockets, watching silently while Carver circled her cell like a vulture. Her heart pounding as she demanded a lawyer, her voice sharp, steady, cutting through their jeers. But Carver just grinned, leaning against the bars, his bulk blocking the dim light, saying no one was coming, not for her, not in this town, his. Words a sledgehammer to her faith in the system she'd bled to uphold. Dutton kicking the cell door for emphasis, the clang ringing in her ears as he muttered about teaching her a lesson, her mind racing, plotting, because she knew her rights, knew this was illegal detention, knew she'd fight it, But the hours crawled by, 3, then 4. Her legs cramping on the cold bench, her blazer no shield against the chills seeping from the concrete. Her thoughts spiraling to the corruption case, the elites she'd been chasing, wondering if this was their doing, a warning to back off. Her eyes locked on Lucas again, his hesitation a crack in their armor. But he said nothing, did nothing. Just watched as the clock ticked past 2 in the morning, her resolve hardening with every taunt. Every second they kept her trapped, until finally her boss, D.A. Calvin Reed, stormed in, his grey suit rumpled, his voice a thunderclap demanding her release, his face tight with rage but his eyes shadowed with something else. Fear maybe, or powerlessness. The precinct buzzing as he flashed his badge, Carver and Dutton stepping back, grudgingly unlocking the cell, their smirks fading, but not gone. Her wrists raw as the cuffs came off, her legs shaky but her spine straight as she walked out. Calvin muttering apologies, saying the police union was untouchable. His tone a warning to let it go, but Amara's blood boiled, her mind already drafting the complaint she'd file, the footage she'd demand, the justice she'd rip from there. Hands because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Her steps echoing as they left, the night air hitting her like a slap. Her sedan waiting where she'd left it, but as she reached it her breath caught. The tires slashed, rubber ribbons splayed across the asphalt, a jagged note tucked under the wiper. "Stay quiet or else," scrawled in black ink, her pulse spiking as she scanned the empty lot, shadows shifting in the distance. Calvin cursing beside her, but she barely heard him, her eyes narrowing, because this wasn't just a stop gone wrong. It was a message, a threat, a gauntlet thrown by men who thought they'd broken her, who didn't know she'd been forged in harder fires than this, her hands trembling not with fear but with rage, because what kind of town let cops cage a woman for her skin, her voice, her fight? Who were these men to think they could silence her with steel and slurs? How far did this rot go, and what would they do when she pushed back? Drop a number 1 in the comments if you think Amara's right to fight this injustice, or a 2 if you tell her to walk away while she still can. Hit that like button if you're rooting for her to take these clowns down, and subscribe to catch every twist as she battles this nightmare, because trust me, it's only getting wilder from here. Her car a wreck, her freedom bruised but her spirit unbroken, the precinct's stench clinging to her as she drove off with Calvin, plotting her next move, unaware of the storm brewing, the footage already spreading, the war escalating, because what happens when a woman like Amara refuses to bend? What'll Carver and Dutton do when their prey turns predator, and how much blood will spill before this ends? Amara Ellis woke to a phone buzzing like a hornet's nest, the grey dawn seeping through her apartment blinds in Crestview, Alabama, her wrists still sore from the cuffs that had bitten into them the night before, her mind replaying the precincts. Cold cell, Carver's slurs, Dutton's kicks, Lucas's silence, and that jagged note on her slashed tires, her body aching as she rolled off the couch where she'd crashed after Calvin dropped her home, her sedan now a useless heap towed to some impound lot, her resolve stealing as she grabbed her laptop, fingers flying over keys to draft a formal complaint against officers Trent Carver and Miles Dutton, her words sharp, citing illegal detention, racial profiling, excessive force, every violation she'd memorized in law school pouring onto the page, her 34 years of fighting a system that despised her fueling every line, her breath steady as she hit send, filing it with the city and the state, knowing it'd stir a hornet's nest of its own. But she didn't expect the storm to break so fast, her phone lighting up with alerts as she brewed coffee, the bitter scent grounding her until she saw it, the arrest video from last night. Shaky footage from that teenage boy's phone now viral online, 200,000 views in hours, her face pressed to the hood, Carver's snarl calling her a mouthy black bitch, Dutton's laugh echoing, the crowd's murmurs a helpless chorus, her stomach twisting as she scrolled comments, some raging, "This is Crestview's shame," others sneering, "She deserved it." The split a knife in her gut, but the protests came quick, dozens gathering outside the precinct by "No on" signs scrawled with "Justice for Amara," their chants a lifeline she clung to, her heart swelling as she watched from her window, thinking maybe this time the city would listen, maybe this time she'd win. But then the backlash hit, a local news channel, Crestview Tonight, flashing her mugshot, the anchor, a slick-haired puppet named Ron Tate, spinning a tale that painted her as a radical agitator, a troublemaker who'd provoked the cops, his voice oily with fake concern as he questioned her history of stirring unrest, her jaw dropping because there was no history, just lies stitched from thin air, her phone buzzing again. This time her boss Calvin, his tone clipped, saying the corruption case files she'd been building, the ones targeting Crestview's elites, had vanished from her office overnight, his words heavy as he warned her to drop the suit. "You're poking a bear you can't kill." But Amara's blood boiled, her voice snapping back that she'd never back down. Not after they'd caged her, not after they'd slashed her tires, not after they'd tried to break her, Calvin sighing, saying she'd regret it. The call ending with a click that felt like a door slamming shut, her resolve doubling as she turned to her community, rallying them on social media, a live stream. From her cramped living room, her voice steady as she recounted the arrest, the precinct, the note, her blazer still wrinkled but her eyes blazing, hundreds tuning in, then thousands. Her words a match to dry grass, protests swelling by dusk, a march planned for tomorrow, her chest tight with hope, thinking she'd turned the tide, until the next blow landed, Carver's crew striking back with venom, doctored footage hitting the web late that night, her arrest remixed to show her swinging at Dutton, a lie so blatant it made her laugh then rage, the edit seamless. Her resistance now gospel to the doubters, Ron Tate running it on loop, calling her a violent fraud, her phone flooded with threats. "Stay in your lane." "You're done?" Her allies wavering, some peeling off, scared of the smear, her hope fraying but her spine stiff, because she'd seen worse, fought harder. Her mind racing to counter this, to prove the truth when the night exploded, a crash shattering her thoughts, bricks sailing through her apartment windows, glass spraying across her floor, her bare feet crunching shards as she ducked, heart hammering, 3 red bricks thudding to a stop, each carved with a message. "Next time, it's you," scrawled in jagged white chalk, her breath catching as she peered out, shadows fleeing into the dark, her pulse a war drum as she grabbed her phone, dialing Calvin, his voice groggy but sharp when he heard, promising to send help, but she knew it was too late. The war had escalated, her home now a battlefield, her fight now a target painted on her back. Carver's reach deeper than she'd feared, his allies ruthless, her viral stand a spark they'd douse with blood if they could, her eyes scanning the wreckage, glass glinting like teeth, her mind whirling, because who'd orchestrated this? How far would they go? What did they fear she'd uncover next? The corruption case, the precinct, the elites all tangled in a web she'd barely begun to pull apart, her hands trembling as she swept up the debris, her resolve a fire they couldn't quench, because Amara Ellis didn't cower, didn't break. Not when they'd caged her, not when they'd smeared her, not now, not ever. The bricks a dare, she'd answer. The footage a lie she'd shred. The threats a chain she'd snap, her apartment a ruin, but her spirit a fortress. The city's pulse throbbing outside, protests growing, news spinning, shadows closing in, because this wasn't just backlash, it was a declaration, a promise of worse to come, a gauntlet she'd pick up because in Crestview, justice wasn't a gift, it was a war. And Amara was its soldier, bloodied but unbowed, the night stretching long and treacherous ahead, her fight just beginning to claw its way through the dark, her enemies circling, her allies faltering, her truth a beacon they'd kill to snuff. Out? The bricks a warning, a prelude, a spark to a firestorm she'd ignite because they'd underestimated her once, and she'd make them pay for it. Every step, every blow, every lie. The cost rising, the stakes soaring, the battle raging. On. Amara Ellis crouched amid the glass-strewn wreckage of her Crestview apartment, the dawn light glinting off the bricks that had crashed through her windows the night before, her bare feet stinging from cuts as she swept debris into a pile, her navy blazer now a tattered shield against the chill, her mind a furnace of rage and focus, the viral lies, the missing corruption files, the "next time it's you" threat fueling her as she dug deeper into the rot choking this town, her 34 years of legal battles sharpening her instincts, her laptop humming as she cross-referenced precinct records leaked by a shaky ally. Officer Lucas Hayes, his brown eyes haunted when he'd slipped her the logs last night, a stack of papers proving officers Trent Carver and Miles Dutton had profiled black drivers for years. Dozens of stops, all bogus, all brutal, her pulse quickening as she traced a thread higher. Sheriff Eli Grayson, a barrel-chested tyrant with a buzz cut and a badge, his name scrawled on payouts tied to Crestview's elites, the same ones she'd targeted in her corruption case, her breath catching as it clicked. This wasn't just about her arrest, it was a warning to drop the probe. Grayson's shadow looming over Carver's taunts, Dutton's kicks, the slashed tires, the bricks, her hands trembling with the weight of it, because she'd found gold, evidence that could topple a kingpin, her resolve stealing as she emailed it to Calvin, her boss pleading for backup. Thinking she'd gained ground, victory close enough to taste, her apartment a war zone, but her spirit unbroken, until the trap sprang, her phone buzzing with a text from Lucas. "Meet me urgent." Her gut twisting as she grabbed her keys, slipping out into the muggy afternoon, Crestview's industrial sprawl buzzing with traffic, her sneakers crunching gravel as she reached her office parking lot, the prosecutors building a squat brick hulk against the skyline, her eyes scanning for Lucas. When shadows lunged, 3 masked thugs in black hoodies bursting from an alley, their fists swinging before she could scream, a punch slamming her jaw, another cracking her ribs, her body crumpling to the asphalt, slurs raining down. "Black bitch lawyer, stay down," their boots stomping her back, her vision blurring as blood pooled under her cheek, her mind clawing at consciousness. Because who sent them? How did they know she'd be here? What did Grayson fear she'd found, her gasps ragged as they vanished, leaving her broken, alive but barely? Sirens wailing in the distance as a janitor's shout brought help, her eyes fluttering open in a hospital bed hours later, sterile white walls swimming, her arm in a sling, her ribs taped, Calvin's face, grim as he loomed over her saying she'd live. But then the hammer fell, cops storming in, Carver smirking at the door, Dutton dangling a bag of white powder, claiming they'd found it in her sedan, her heart sinking as they cuffed her good wrist to the bed, a new arrest warrant crackling over their radio, drug possession. A lie so bold it choked her, her voice hoarse as she protested. "That's planted?" But Carver just grinned, saying she'd pushed too far. Grayson's voice booming on TV outside, a press conference calling her a drug-pushing fraud, her allies scattering, the janitor gone, Lucas nowhere, her phone confiscated, her evidence buried, her body screaming as they dragged her from the bed, hospital gown flapping, her mind racing because this was no coincidence. Grayson's reach had crushed her, the beating a setup, the drugs a frame, her fight a spark they'd smother with chains, her breath shallow as they hauled her back to the precinct, the same cell waiting colder now, crueler. Her hope fraying as Grayson's shadow grew, his empire striking back with a fist she hadn't seen coming, her allies terrified into silence, Calvin's warnings ringing true because what kind of system let a sheriff frame her, beat her, break her just for digging too deep? How could Carver and Dutton smile while her blood stained the pavement? Who'd stand with her when the world believed the lie? Drop a number 1 in the comments if you're furious Amara's being framed for fighting back, or a 2 if you think she should have stayed quiet to save herself. Smash that like button if you're cheering her on through this hell. Hand subscribe to see her claw her way out, because this setup's just the start. Her hospital bed a battlefield, her cuffs a dare, her truth a weapon they can't bury yet. So what happens when Amara's pushed past the edge, when the hunter becomes the hunted, when the system bets she'll break? Amara Ellis's good wrist throbbed against the hospital bed's cuff. The sterile room a prison now, her bruised ribs aching with every shallow breath, the TV outside blaring Sheriff Eli Grayson's smug voice calling her a drug-pushing fraud. Her 34-year-old frame battered, but her mind a steel trap, plotting escape as officers Trent Carver and Miles Dutton loomed in the hall, their smirks a promise of worse to come, her hospital gown flapping as she tugged at the restraint, her other arm in a sling from the masked thug's ambush, her eyes darting to the window, 3 stories up, no way out there, her pulse racing, as she overheard Carver mutter about finishing her, her resolve hardening because she wouldn't rot in their cell again, not with planted drugs pinning her, not with Grayson's empire closing in, her chance coming when a nurse slipped. In a wiry woman with tired eyes who whispered, "You don't deserve this." Uncuffing her under the guise of a bandage change, Amara's heart leaping as she bolted, gown trailing, bare feet slapping tile, alarms blaring as she ducked into a stairwell, Carver's roar echoing behind, her ribs screaming but her legs pumping, down 3 flights, had a service door into Crestview's muggy dusk, the industrial sprawl swallowing her as she ran, her breath ragged, her mind locked on survival, because facing jail meant death. Grayson's reach too deep, her only shot now to vanish. Her sneakers, lost in the beating, her feet bleeding as she reached a friend's house, Tasha Cole, a paralegal who'd stood by her, her attic a sanctuary where Amara hid, dust choking her lungs as she pieced together Grayson's web, her laptop glowing in the dark, linking him to a cartel laundering cash through Crestview's elites, her corruption case reborn in shadows, her hands trembling as she typed, Lucas. Hayes knocking hours later, his lean frame tense, his brown eyes shadowed with guilt as he handed her a burner phone, saying he'd help, his voice low as he confessed he'd seen the frame-up, her trust wavering but her options nil because who else could she turn to? What choice did she have with Grayson's dogs on her scent, her plan forming fast? A sting to trap Carver, Lucas setting it up, a meet at an abandoned warehouse, her breath steady as she coached him through it, recording gear hidden in his jacket, her fingers crossed as he left, hours ticking by until he called, voice tight, "Got him!" Her heart soaring as she played the tape, Carver's gravelly growl admitting the drugs were planted, Grayson's orders, her victory sweet as. She uploaded it online from Tasha's attic, the audio hitting 10,000 plays in an hour, public fury erupting, hashtags flooding, free Amara, end Grayson. Her name a rallying cry again, protests swelling by dawn, news breaking Carver's suspension, her chest tight with hope, thinking she'd flipped the board, justice clawing back, until Grayson struck. A SWAT team crashing through Tasha's door at noon, black boots stomping, rifles gleaming, their shouts a thunderclap as Amara froze. The trap sprung, someone had sold her out, her eyes locking on Tasha's wide stare, as bullets tore through the attic, wood splintering, her friend diving to shield her, a slug ripping Tasha's chest, blood spraying as she fell. Amara's scream swallowed by chaos, her hands clawing the floorboards, dragging herself to a window, glass shattering as she leapt, 2 stories down, her ankle twisting on impact, pain searing but adrenaline pumping, her body rolling into a ditch, SWAT lights sweeping overhead, Grayson's voice crackling over their radio, "You'll never outrun me." Her breath hitching as she crawled through mud, Tasha's body a weight on her soul, her ally dead because of her. The taper win turned curse because how had they known who'd flipped? What had she missed, her mind racing as she hid, reeds cutting her skin, her hospital gown a shredded rag, her sling gone, her arm throbbing, the city's pulse a distant hum as sirens wailed, her victory ashes now. Grayson's retaliation a blade sharper than she'd feared, his empire unyielding, her flight a gamble with no end, because this wasn't just a raid, it was a slaughter, a message carved in blood, her friend's blood. Her fight a spark they'd drown in it, her eyes burning with tears she wouldn't shed, not yet because Amara Ellis didn't break, not even now, not with death so close, her hands clutching mud, her resolve a ember they couldn't snuff, because who'd betrayed her? How deep did this rot go? What would Grayson do when she rose again, the ditch her refuge, the night her shield, the war roaring louder, her escape a threadbare hope against a noose tightening, her body broken but her spirit a furnace because they'd killed Tasha, framed her, hunted her, and still she breathed, still she fought. The tape a weapon they couldn't silence, the city watching, waiting, fearing, as she vanished into the dark. A ghost they'd rue, a storm they'd unleashed, because in Crestview justice wasn't won, it was bled for, and Amara's blood was just the start. The raid a scar, the betrayal a mystery, the fight a firestorm. She'd fan, no matter the cost, no matter the loss, no matter the pain. Amara Ellis shivered in the ditch's muddy embrace, her twisted ankle pulsing with pain, her hospital gown a shredded rag clinging to her bruised skin, Tasha's blood still staining her hands as Crestview's sirens faded into the humid night, her 34-year-old body a map of scars from Grayson's war, the SWAT raid that killed her friend a fresh wound in her soul, her breath shallow as she dragged herself upright, reeds slicing her palms, her mind a furnace of grief and fury, the tape of Carver's confession still burning online. 1 million views now, the city's rage her lifeline as she stumbled through back roads, Barefoot, homeless, hunted. Her arm throbbing where the sling had been torn away, her ribs creaking with every step. Her destination unclear, but her purpose ironclad. Because Grayson's voice on that radio, "You'll never outrun me," was a dare she'd answer. Her fight a flame they couldn't douse. Her next move forming as dawn broke, grey light spilling over the industrial sprawl. Her silhouette a ghost as she reached a gas station. A payphone, her salvation. Her voice hoarse as she called a protest leader, Jamal Pierce, a wiry activist who'd marched for her before. His tone urgent as he promised a rally, City Hall noon. Her name their banner, her heart pounding as she hid in a dumpster, trash reeking around her, hours ticking by until thousands gathered, their chants shaking the pavement. Justice for Amara, signs stabbing the air, her eyes peering from a stolen hoodie, her ankles swollen but her spirit soaring. Because this was power, this was hope. The tape's impact forcing a state investigation into Grayson's crew, news vans circling, her chest tight as she slipped into the crowd. Jamal's megaphone roaring her story, the arrest, the frame-up, Tasha's death, her voice joining his, raw and unbroken. "I won't stop," the crowd erupting, thousands hailing her. Victory close enough to taste. Carver's suspension a crack in their armor. Her resolve a beacon as she thought she'd turned the tide. Until Grayson's counterstrike landed. Officer Trent Carver, free on bail. His rage a Molotov cocktail igniting chaos. His planted agitators surging through the rally. Bottles raining. Fire. Glass shattering as screams replaced chants. Amara's eyes widening as flames licked the sky. A brick slamming her shoulder, pinning her under rubble as a car exploded nearby. Her lungs choking on smoke. Her body trapped. The crowd scattering in panic, her hope drowning in the inferno. Lucas Hayes's lean frame bursting through the haze, his hands clawing debris, pulling her free at the last second. Her breath gasping as he dragged her to an alley, flames roaring behind, news choppers buzzing overhead. Crestview Tonight spinning it fast, Ron Tate's oily voice blaming her. Amara Ellis incites deadly riot. Her name a curse again, her allies vanishing, fear silencing them. Her ankle screaming as she leaned on Lucas, his guilt a shadow in his eyes, her mind reeling because who'd flipped this rally into a war zone? How had Carver orchestrated this from jail? What kind of power let him burn her world again? Her victory ashes now. Grayson's next move a guillotine dropping, his voice crackling on a police scanner Lucas clutched. $50,000. For her head. A bounty echoing through the city. Her blood chilling as shadows shifted, every face a threat. Her supporters gone. Her fight a target painted in fire. Because this wasn't just chaos, it was a purge. A message carved in flames. Her rally a trap she'd walked into, her eyes burning with smoke and tears. Her resolve a ember they couldn't crush because Amara Ellis didn't fold. Not even now. Not with a price on her life. Her hands clutching Lucas, her trust fraying but her options dust. The alley a lifeline, the city a hunter, the war a inferno she'd stoke, because who'd stand with her? When death was the prize, how far would Grayson go to bury her? What would she do when the hunted struck back? Drop a number 1 in the comments if you're raging at Grayson's bounty on Amara, or a 2 if you think she's in over her head. Hit that like button if you're gripped by her fight against this firestorm, and subscribe to catch every blaze. As she battles on, because this rally's just the spark. Her life a wager, her truth a weapon they can't snuff yet. So what happens when a city turns predator? When a bounty paints her prey? When Amara's cornered with nowhere left to run? Amara Ellis huddled in a rural shack, 30 miles outside Crestview, Alabama. Her swollen ankle propped on a crate, her bruised body wrapped in a threadbare blanket Lucas Hayes had scrounged from his truck, the air thick with dust and desperation as cicadas buzzed beyond the warped wooden walls. Her 34-year-old frame a tapestry of pain from the rally's rubble, Tasha's death, and Grayson's $50,000 bounty, her mind a relentless engine churning through the chaos. Her hospital gown long gone, replaced by a stained t-shirt and jeans Lucas had grabbed, her ribs aching with every breath. Her resolve a fire stoked by the city's betrayal, the riot's flames still searing her memory as she pored over Grayson's financial records. Scraps Lucas had smuggled from the precinct, her fingers tracing cartel payments funneled through Crestview's elites. The corruption case she'd lost, now reborn in this splintered hideout, her eyes burning as she linked the sheriff to a Mexican drug lord, millions laundered through shell companies. Her heart pounding because this was dynamite enough to bury him. Lucas pacing beside her, his lean frame tense, his brown eyes shadowed with guilt as he muttered about redemption, his hands trembling as he handed her a burner phone, her voice steady as she dialed a judge she'd clerked for years ago. Margaret Klein, a steely woman with a spine of iron, her tone sharp as she listened, promising to fast-track Amara's appointment as an emergency magistrate, a legal lifeline to oversee Grayson's unraveling empire, her breath catching as Klein pulled strings, the state's investigation from the rally tape giving her leverage, her shack a war room as she prepped, days blurring into nights, her ankle throbbing but her spirit soaring, because this was her turn, her shot, the call coming at dawn. "You're in." Klein's voice a lifeline, her journey back to Crestview, a blur. Lucas driving, her eyes fixed ahead, the courthouse looming, a grey fortress against the industrial sprawl, her robe heavy as she took the bench. Carver's arraignment, her first case, his broad frame shackled, his buzzed head bowed. Dutton beside, him wiry and pale, their eyes widening in shock as she stared down. Her gavel a scepter, her voice cutting as she read charges, racial profiling, assault, the frame-up, their smug masks cracking, her heart racing because this was justice, this was power. Crowds cheering outside, her name a hymn again, her chest tight with triumph, thinking she'd flipped the game until Grayson's wrath erupted, a bomb ripping. Through the courthouse mid-hearing, the blast a thunderclap shattering glass, toppling beams, her bench splintering as she dove, screams echoing, her ears ringing, dust choking her lungs. Her body slammed to the floor, blood trickling from her temple, her eyes blinking through haze. Bodies strewn, clerks, bailiffs, dozens, dead, her breath hitching as she crawled. Lucas pulling her from wreckage, his face bloodied, her mind reeling. Because who'd done this? How had Grayson reached her here? What kind of monster bombed justice itself? Her victory ashes now, the cheers silenced, her gavel lost in rubble, her robe torn, her resolve tested as she staggered out. Flames licking the sky, sirens wailing, news vans swarming, Crestview tonight, spinning it fast. Ron Tate's voice blaming her reckless crusade, her allies, faltering, her hope fraying until Lucas shoved a phone at her, a text from her sister Lena. "I'm safe." Relief flooding until she scrolled, a casualty list flashing. Lena's name stark among the dead, her knees buckling, Grayson's chilling message clear. Family's next. Her sister gone, her fight a curse that had killed her. The bombing, a blade sharper than riots. Her judicial power a hollow shell because this wasn't just retaliation. It was annihilation, a strike at her soul. Her hands clutching the phone, her eyes burning with tears she couldn't shed. Her voice a whisper. Lena. Her spirit a ember. They couldn't crush, because Amara Ellis didn't break. Not even. Now not with her sister's blood on their hands. Her shack a memory, her bench a ruin. Her fight a war she'd wage alone if she had to. Because they'd taken everything. Her home, her friend, her family. And still she stood. Still she breathed. The courthouse a graveyard, the city a hunter. The warry inferno she'd stoke. Her body battered but her mind ablade, because how could she judge when her own were dying? What would she do with power turned poison? Who'd pay when the smoke cleared? The rubble her throne, the loss her, fuel. The battle roaring louder, her turn a trap she'd walked into. Grayson's empire unyielding, her sister's name a scar she'd carry. Her resolve a furnace they couldn't quench, because they'd underestimated her once, and she'd make them bleed for it every step, every death, every tear. The cost soaring, the stakes infinite, the fight a firestorm. She'd fan through the dark. Amara Ellis knelt in the smoldering ruins of the Crestview courthouse, her torn judicial robe streaked with ash, her 34-year-old body trembling from the bomb that had stolen her sister Lena, her swollen ankle a dull ache beneath the grief clawing her chest, her bloodied temple throbbing as Lucas Hayes dragged her from the wreckage, his lean frame battered, his brown eyes wide with shock, the air thick with smoke and screams, her hands clutching the ground where dozens lay, Dead, Grayson's family's next echoing in her skull, her resolve a jagged edge as she staggered upright. The city's industrial sprawl a blur beyond the flames, her mind a furnace of loss and fury, because this wasn't just a strike, it was a slaughter, her judicial bench a grave, her fight a curse. But she wouldn't break. Not yet. Her voice, hoarse as she demanded a new venue, a secure courthouse 50 miles north in Montgomery. Her gavel lost but her authority intact, Lucas driving her through backroads, her eyes fixed on revenge, the state granting her plea, a fortress of steel and glass rising against the skyline. Her robe replaced, her wounds bandaged, her spirit a ember they couldn't snuff. Days blurring as she tightened evidence. Carvers, taped confession, Grayson's cartel links, precinct logs, her hands steady as she took the bench again. Officers Trent Carver and Miles Dutton shackled before her, their broad and wiry frames stiff, their faces pale as she read decades long. Sentences, racial profiling, assault, corruption, her voice a blade slicing their smug masks. Carver's buzzed head bowing, Dutton's pinched eyes darting, her heart pounding because this was justice, this was her stand. Crowds roaring outside. Amara reigns, her chest tight with triumph, thinking she'd won. The war tilting her, Way Grayson's empire cracking, her sister's death a fuel she'd wield, until the trap snapped shut, Sheriff Eli Grayson's men striking back with venom. A black van screeching up as she left the courthouse, masked figures lunging, her scream cut short as they seized Lucas, his body thrashing, her fists swinging uselessly, a hood yanked over her head, her world blackening as tires squealed, her mind reeling because who'd planned this? How had they breached security? What did they want now? Her breath shallow as they dumped her in a warehouse, Lucas's cries echoing, a live stream flickering on, his battered face filling a screen, Grayson's voice booming, "Resign, or he dies," her stomach twisting as they broke his fingers. One by one, blood pooling, her voice cracking as she refused. Never. Her eyes blazing because she'd lost Lena. She wouldn't lose him too, her mind racing, a plan forming, her hands fumbling a loose nail from the floor, hours ticking. As she sought her bonds, Grayson's men distracted, her breath steady as she lunged, freeing Lucas, his groans a spur as she kicked her captor down, her ribs screaming but her will iron, their escape a blur through rusted halls. Her victory speech planned that night, her chest swelling because she'd outsmarted them, saved him, turned the tide until the ruse unfolded. Her water bottle at the podium laced with poison, a slow burn in her throat mid-sentence, her words slurring, "Justice will." Her body collapsing, the crowd gasping, her eyes rolling back, Lucas's shout distant as she hit the floor, waking hours later in a hospital, tubes snaking her arms. Calvin's grim face looming. "You're off the bench." Her judicial post revoked under health concerns, Grayson smirking on TV, her mind whirling because this wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a betrayal, a mole in her circle, her win a mirage, her power stripped, Lucas safe but her fight gutted, because who'd poisoned her? How had Grayson played her? What had she missed in the shadows, her body weak but her spirit a furnace, her hands clutching sheets, her resolve a ember they couldn't crush, because Amara Ellis didn't fold, not, even now, not with venom in her veins, her bench stolen, her ally bruised, her war a gauntlet. She'd run alone if she must, because they'd taken her family, her power, her breath, and still she lived. Still she fought. The hospital, a cage, the city a predator, the battle a inferno she'd stoke, her eyes burning with a fire they'd rue, because they'd underestimated her once and she'd make them pay. Every trap, every lie, every drop, the cost infinite, the stakes soaring, the fight a firestorm. She'd fan through the dark, so drop. A number 1 in the comments if you're stunned. Grayson's men poisoned Amara. Horror 2 if you saw this twist coming. Smash that like button if you're hooked on her unbreakable spirit. And subscribe to catch every pulse as she rises again. Because this trap's just the bait, her fall a spark, her truth a blade. They can't. Blunt yet. So what happens when the prey turns hunter? When the poison fuels her fire? When Amara strikes back from the ashes? Amara Ellis lay in a Montgomery hospital bed, her throat raw from the poison that had felled her mid-speech, tubes snaking her arms, her 34-year-old body weak, but her mind a sharpened blade, the TV flickering with Sheriff Eli Grayson's smug grin as he gloated over her judicial ousting, her chest tight with fury, her bruised ribs aching from the warehouse escape. Lucas Hayes slumped in a chair beside her, his battered hands bandaged from the kidnapping, his brown eyes hollow with guilt, her resolve a furnace stoked by Lena's death, Tasha's sacrifice, the bomb, the venom, because they'd stripped her bench but not her fight, her voice a rasp. As she demanded her laptop, Calvin's protests ignored, her fingers trembling as she typed, leaking Grayson's cartel proof to the feds, wire transfers, shell companies, millions laundered through Crestview's elites, her corruption case A, Phoenix rising from ashes, her breath steady as she hit send, hours ticking by until news broke. Federal raids dismantling Grayson's empire, choppers buzzing, his mansion swarmed, her heart pounding because this was her strike, her win. Grayson's arrest flashing on screen, cuffs snapping on his wrists, her eyes blazing as the state reinstated her as judge. An emergency decree from Governor Klein, her hospital gown swapped for a robe, her body frail but her spirit iron as she returned to Crestview. The courthouse, rebuilt, her bench a throne, crowds cheering. Amara's back, her chest swelling with triumph, thinking she'd ended it, the war hers, until Grayson's loyalists roared back, a midnight assault shattering her fragile peace, her apartment door splintering as masked. Men stormed in, their boots thudding, her scream cut short as they dragged her from bed, her ribs cracking anew, her mind reeling because how had they found her? Who'd tipped them? What did they want now? Her body flung into a van, tires screeching through Crestview's industrial sprawl, her hands clawing for escape. The ride, ending at an abandoned mill, rusted beams looming, gasoline stench hitting her as they doused her, liquid soaking her hair, her skin, matches glinting in their hands, a live stream flickering on, millions watching, her face a mask of defiance as they taunted, "Burn, black bitch!" Her heart racing because this was it, her end, Grayson's final play, her eyes locking on a figure in the dark, Lucas, his lean. Frame staggering, blood dripping from a gash, his gun trembling as he fired. One captor dropping, her breath hitching as he lunged, cutting her bonds, flames erupting as a match hit the floor, her body rolling free, fire licking her heels, her hair singed, her lungs choking on smoke. Lucas dragging her out, mill walls collapsing, her skin blistered, her eyes streaming, her escape a miracle, sirens wailing as they stumbled into the night, her victory a mirage again because Grayson wasn't done. News breaking hours later, his escape from custody, a bribed guard, a helicopter lifting him from jail, his voice crackling online. This isn't the end. Her stomach sinking, her burns stinging, her fight a curse that had spared her but not broken him, because this wasn't just an attack, it was a spectacle, a promise of worse, her federal coup, a spark they'd drown in fire, her hands clutching Lucas, her trust fraying, but her options. Dust, the mill a pyre she'd survived, the city a hunter, the war a inferno she'd stoke, her body scarred but her mind a weapon, because how could he escape? Who'd freed him? What would he do with freedom regained? Her hospital a memory, her bench a target, her fight a gauntlet she'd run alone if she must, because they'd burned her, framed her, hunted her, and still she stood, still she breathed, the flames a scar, the escape a taunt, the battle a firestorm she'd fan, her eyes burning with a fury they'd rue because Amara Ellis didn't break, not even now. Not with fire in her veins, her ally bleeding, her enemy loose. Her wore a threadbare hope against a noose tightening, her hands clutching dirt, her resolve a ember they couldn't crush because they'd underestimated her once, and she'd make them bleed for it. Every trap, every flame, every flight, the cost infinite, the stakes soaring, the fight ablaze she'd wield through the dark because Grayson's escape wasn't a win, it was a dare, a gauntlet she'd pick up, a war she'd wage, no matter the pain, no matter the loss, no matter the cost. Amara Ellis stumbled through Crestview's industrial outskirts, her blistered skin stinging from the mill fire, her 34-year-old body a patchwork of burns and bruises, her lungs still raw from smoke as Lucas Hayes limped beside her, his lean frame bloodied from the rescue, his brown eyes darting with fear. Sheriff Eli Grayson's escape from custody a fresh wound in her mind, his taunt, This isn't the end! A drumbeat driving her forward, her resolve a furnace stoked. By Lena's death, Tasha's sacrifice, the bomb, the poison, the flames, because they'd burned her world but not her fight. Her voice a rasp as she rallied a federal task force, her judicial robe swapped for a Kevlar vest, her burns bandaged but her spirit iron, her hands steady as she briefed agents. Grayson's. Cartel ties her weapon, the feds moving fast, choppers buzzing, her heart pounding as they tracked him to a warehouse 40 miles south, a rusted hulk squatting amid overgrown weeds, her breath shallow as they stormed it, rifles gleaming, her eyes locked on Grayson's barrel-chested silhouette, his buzz cut glinting under floodlights, his sneer a challenge as gunfire erupted, bullets pinging steel, her body ducking behind crates, Lucas at her side, her mind racing because this was it, her showdown, her shot, agents swarming, Grayson's men falling, her voice cutting through. Chaos via video link to Montgomery, testifying live, Cartel ledgers, taped confessions, her words a noose tightening, his life sentence sealed as cuffs snapped on, his roar swallowed by cheers, her chest swelling with triumph, crowds hailing her outside. Amara wins. Her fight a beacon, thinking she'd ended it, the war hers, until Officer Miles Dutton struck back, free on a technicality, his wiry frame a shadow in her rear view as she drove home, her sedan humming through the night, her burns itching under bandages, her mind easing for the first time in months when headlights flared, a truck ramming her off a bridge, her car plunging into icy water, metal crumpling, glass shattering, her scream lost as cold swallowed her, her hands clawing the wheel, her lungs burning as she kicked free, water flooding in, her body thrashing, her burns searing in the chill, her head breaking surface, gasping, her eyes scanning the dark, Dutton's truck gone, her breath hitching as she swam, clawing muddy. Banks, her strength fading, her resolver ember pulling her up, her body soaked, freezing, staggering forward, sirens faint as she reached a road, her mind reeling because who'd freed Dutton? How had he known her route? What was this revenge? Her victory, a mirage again, her phone buzzing in her pocket, a text flashing, "Check your mom." Her blood chilling as she ran, barefoot, shivering, miles blurring until she saw it. Her mother's house on the horizon, flames licking the sky, a fireball where her childhood stood. Grayson's final order from prison, her knees buckling, her scream, tearing the night. "Mama?" Her mother gone. Her fight a curse that had raised her family because this wasn't just a crash, it was annihilation. A strike at her roots, her hands clutching wet earth, her eyes streaming with tears she couldn't hold. Her voice, a whisper, "No more." Her spirit a ember they couldn't crush because Amara Ellis didn't break. Not even now, not with her mother's ashes in the wind. Her car a wreck, her ally bleeding, her enemy caged but unbowed, her war a gauntlet. She'd run alone if she must, because they'd taken everything. Her home, her friends, her kin, and still she breathed. Still she fought, the bridge a trap, the fire a scar, the battle a inferno. She'd stoke, her body trembling but her mind a blade, because how could Grayson reach from bars who'd lit this blaze? What would she do with nothing left to lose? Her mother's house a pyre, her victory a hollow shell, her fight a war she'd waged through tears, her eyes burning with a fury they'd rue because they'd underestimated her once, and she'd make them pay, every strike, every loss, every flame, the cost infinite, the stakes soaring, the fight a firestorm she'd fanned through the dark, her hands clutching mud, her resolve a ember they couldn't snuff because Grayson's sentence wasn't the end. It was a spark, a dare she'd answer, a war she'd wage, no matter the pain, no matter the grief, no matter the cost. The sirens closing in, the night a shroud, the battle roaring on. Amara Ellis staggered through the smoky ruins of her mother's burning house, her soaked clothes clinging to her blistered skin, her 34-year-old body shivering from the icy bridge plunge, her lungs raw as sirens wailed closer. The flames, a roaring testament to Sheriff Eli Grayson's prison reach, her mother's death a fresh gash atop Lena's, Tasha's, her resolve a furnace stoked by loss, her burns stinging as she sank to her knees, mud caking her hands, her eyes streaming with grief she couldn't bury. Lucas Hayes limping up, his lean frame battered from their mill escape, his brown eyes wide with horror, her voice a rasp as She demanded a federal probe, her judicial robe a memory, but her authority a lifeline. Her hands steady as she called Calvin, her boss, pleading for resources, her breath shallow as she rebuilt, days blurring in a Montgomery safe house. Her ankle, swollen, her ribs aching, her mind a blade slicing through Grayson's network, her evidence mounting, cartel ties, bribed guards. His life sentence a spark she'd fan, her return to Crestview a calculated strike, the courthouse fortified, her bench a fortress. Officer, Miles Dutton's retrial her focus, his wiry frame shackled, his pinched eyes glaring as she nailed him with life without parole, assault, corruption, the bridge crash, her voice cutting. No mercy. His technicality a ghost she'd banished. Her heart pounding because this was justice. This was reckoning. The city honoring her resilience. A gala planned, her chest tight with triumph, thinking she'd clawed peace from chaos. Grayson caged, Dutton crushed. Her mother's ashes a fuel she'd wield, until the cartel struck back. Her convoy to the gala a target. 3 SUVs humming through dusk, her burns bandaged under a black dress, her mind easing as Lucas rode shotgun, his guilt a shadow when a blast erupted, the lead vehicle exploding, flames swallowing steel, her SUV flipping, her body slamming glass, her leg snapping, pain searing as wreckage pinned her, screams echoing, her breath choking on dust, blood trickling from her scalp, her eyes blinking through haze, agents dead, her gala a mirage, Lucas clawing her free, his hands trembling, her mind reeling because who'd bombed her now? How had Grayson's allies reached her? What kind of war was this? Her triumph ashes again, her leg shattered, her resolve tested as Lucas dragged her to a ditch, sirens wailing, news vans swarming, Crestview tonight spinning it fast, Ron Tate's voice, blaming her reckless vendetta, her allies faltering, her hope fraying until Lucas shoved a file at her, his voice low. I'm turning state's evidence. His confession a bomb of its own, cartel names, payoffs, his guilt a key, her chest swelling because this was leverage, this was power. Her eyes blazing as she thought they'd won. Grayson's empire gutted, her leg a ruin, but her fight alive, until a sniper's bullet grazed her scalp, a crack splitting the night, her body dropping, Lucas shielding. Her a note pinned nearby. You'll never be safe. Her blood chilling, her burns screaming. Her war a curse that had spared her but not ended, because this wasn't just an ambush. It was a promise, a global wrath dwarfing Grayson's, her hands clutching dirt, her eyes burning with tears she wouldn't shed, her voice a whisper. Not. Yet, her spirit a ember they couldn't crush, because Amara Ellis didn't break, not even now, not with her leg snapped, her convoy ash, her ally bleeding, her enemies boundless, her fight a gauntlet she'd run alone if she must, because they'd taken her family, her power, her peace, and still she breathed, still she fought. The ditch a refuge, the sniper a spectre, the battle a inferno she'd stoke, her body broken but her mind a weapon, because how could cartels reach her? Who'd aim that shot? What would she do with her last stand crumbling? Her gala a trap, her reckoning a hollow shell, her war a firestorm she'd wage through pain, her eyes fixed on Lucas, her trust a threadbare hope, her resolve. Her ember they couldn't snuff because they'd underestimated her once, and she'd make them pay. Every bomb, every bullet, every loss, the cost infinite, the stakes soaring, the fight ablaze she'd found through the dark, her hands gripping earth, her spirit a fortress, because Grayson's fall wasn't the end. It was a spark, a dare she'd answer, a war she'd wage, no matter the ruin, no matter the blood, no matter the cost, the night a shroud, the battle roaring on. Amara Ellis slumped in a makeshift courtroom 50 miles from Crestview's ashes, her 34-year-old body a wreck of burns and bandages, her shattered leg propped in a cast, her blistered skin stinging from the convoy bomb. The snipers graze a fresh scar on her scalp, her judicial robe sweat-stained as she gripped a gavel, her breath shallow but her resolve a furnace stoked by every loss. Lena Tasha, her mother. The city's cheers a distant echo as officers Trent Carver and Miles Dutton sat shackled before her, their broad and wiry frames rigid, their once smug faces drained of color. Lucas Hayes beside them, his lean frame tense, his brown eyes averted, her voice cutting as she sentenced them, Carver and Dutton to life for assault, corruption, murder, her words a blade slicing their masks, her heart pounding because this was justice, her fight's peak, crowds roaring outside. Amara reigns, her chest tight with triumph, thinking she'd won, until her phone buzzed, a chilling call shattering the moment. "Your home's burning," the voice cold, her allies arson. A gut punch, her victory hollow as Grayson's loyalists struck again, her hands trembling as she slammed the gavel, her eyes blazing because this wasn't over. Not yet. Her mind racing as she dug deeper. Lucas's evidence from the cartel a key, her resolve iron as she set a sting, her voice steady as she coached feds, a trap in a Montgomery diner, her breath hitching as they moved, hours ticking until Carver's smirk faltered on a hidden feed, Lucas confessing, "I fed Grayson intel," his words a sledgehammer, her stomach twisting because this was betrayal, her ally the mole, her trust a ruin, her eyes locking on him as cuffs snapped, her voice a rasp sentencing him to decades for conspiracy, his guilt a scar she'd wield, her chest swelling because she'd outsmarted them, trapped the traitor, ended the war, the courtroom silent, her fight a beacon thinking it was done, Grayson caged, his empire dust, her spirit a ember they couldn't crush, until a clerk slipped her a sealed file, her hands shaking as she tore it open. Sheriff Eli Grayson pardoned that morning, a corrupt governor bribed, his release a secret kept until now, her blood chilling as she staggered out, sirens wailing, her apartment ablaze in the distance, flames licking the sky, Grayson's laugh crackling online. "You thought you'd win." Her mind reeling because this wasn't justice, it was a gutting, her bench a mirage, her war a trap she'd ruled, her eyes streaming as she stood judge-prey powerless, her mother's house ash, her sister's grave cold, her friend's blood dry, her hands clutching the file, her resolver ember flickering because how had he bought freedom? Who'd sold her out beyond Lucas? What could she do with nothing left? Her sentencing a hollow echo, her fight a curse that had spared her, but not one, her body broken but her mind a blade. Because Amara Ellis didn't break, not even now, not with her world ash, her ally a liar, her enemy free, her war a gauntlet she'd run alone. Because they'd taken everything, her family, her power, her peace, and still she breathed, still she fought. The courtroom a memory, the city a predator, the battle a inferno she'd stoke, her eyes burning with a fury they'd rue because they'd underestimated her once and she'd make them pay. Every lie, every flame, every betrayal, the cost infinite, the stakes soaring, the fight a firestorm she'd fanned through the dark. Her hands empty, but her spirit a fortress. Because Grayson's pardon wasn't the end, it was a spark, a dare she'd answer, a war reborn. Her apartment a pyre, her justice a ghost, her resolve a ember. They couldn't snuff because this twist wasn't defeat, it was a beginning, a reckoning deferred. A battle she'd wage no matter the ruin, no matter the blood, no matter the cost. The night a shroud, the flames a call, the war roaring on. Her gavel a memory, her power stripped, her truth a weapon. They couldn't bury, because in Crestview justice wasn't won, it was bled for. And Amara's blood was a river, her fight a storm, her story a wound that'd fester, a fire that'd burn, a war that'd rage because they'd freed the beast and she'd hunt them. Judge or prey, alive or ash, the end a lie, the fight eternal, the twist a noose she'd slip, a dawn she'd chase, a vengeance she'd claim. The saga of Amara Ellis offers a raw, unflinching look at resilience in the face of systemic racism and betrayal. Her journey teaches us that justice isn't a straight path, but a battlefield, where every step forward can meet a fiercer blow. Amara's initial arrest by officers Trent Carver and Miles Dutton wasn't just a personal attack. It was a symptom of a deeper rot, a system rigged to silence those who dare to rise. Her refusal to back down, even after beatings, bombings, and the loss of her family, underscores a core lesson. Strength isn't the absence of pain, but the will to fight through it. She turned every setback, smeared reputations, planted drugs, burning homes into fuel, showing that adversity can forge an unbreakable spirit. Another takeaway is the cost of trust. Lucas Hayes' betrayal, feeding intel to Sheriff Eli Grayson, reveals how allies can become the sharpest knives. Amara's story warns us to question those closest, especially when power and corruption lurk nearby. Yet her persistence in rallying communities and leveraging evidence against Grayson's empire highlights the power of collective resistance. One voice can spark a movement, but it's the chorus that shakes the foundations of injustice. The final twist, Grayson's pardon, teaches a bitter truth. Victories can be illusions. Amara's judicial triumphs were undone by a corrupt governor, proving that systemic racism isn't just in the streets, but in the halls of power. It's a call to look beyond the surface, to fight not just the obvious villains, but the invisible hands pulling strings. Her story ends not in defeat, but in defiance. A reminder that the war for justice is relentless, demanding courage even when hope seems lost. For us, Amara's lessons are a mirror. How do we respond when the odds stack against us? Do we bend under pressure or rise like she did? Her fight urges us to stand firm, to seek truth, and to never let silence be our answer to oppression. So what's your take? Drop a comment with a 1 if you'd fight like Amara, or a 2 if you'd seek another way. Hit like if her grit inspires you. Subscribe for more tales of justice, and share this if you believe in battling corruption. Thanks for joining this journey. May you find strength to face your own wars and chase a world where justice isn't just a dream,